I still remember the sound of the rain that morning. It was soft, hesitant, like the world itself was afraid to wake me up. My small house stood silent except for the ticking of the old clock hanging above the kitchen table. I had always loved that clock. My husband bought it the year our son Daniel was born. Every tick had once been a comfort to me, a reminder that time moves forward, no matter what. But that morning it felt different. It sounded like a warning, a slow countdown to something I could not yet name. My hands trembled as I poured tea into the cracked porcelain cup, the same one Daniel used when he visited. Only this time his chair was empty. He hadn't come for a week. I tried to tell myself he was busy. He always said he was. "Work, Mom," he'd say, brushing off my worry with a tired smile. "You know how it is." I wanted to believe him, but a mother's heart always knows when something is wrong. And that morning, I felt it in my bones. Something was terribly wrong. For days, my mind had been restless. I couldn't sleep properly, couldn't eat without feeling a pit in my stomach. I thought about calling him again, but my pride stopped me. I didn't want to sound desperate. After all, I had raised him to be strong, independent, capable. I didn't want to be the mother who clung too tightly. But when I opened the drawer that held my savings book, my breath caught in my throat. The drawer was there, but the little brown envelope, the one where I kept all my life savings, was gone. At first, I thought maybe I misplaced it. I searched the shelves, the kitchen, even under the bed. Nothing. My knees grew weak, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep myself from collapsing. That money wasn't just paper to me. It was years of sacrifice, every coin saved from meals skipped, every penny earned from mending clothes for neighbors after my husband passed away. It was the security that gave me peace in my old age. And now it was gone. I ran to the small wooden box where I kept the duplicate bank book, and when I flipped through the pages, my world shattered. The balance, once full and comforting, was empty. Completely empty. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I could barely read the last line of withdrawal entries. Each date corresponded to days when Daniel had visited me recently. The realization struck like lightning. My own son had done this. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I sank to the floor, clutching the book to my chest, rocking back and forth as silent tears burned my eyes. How could he? How could the boy I raised with every ounce of love betray me this way? I thought of his smile when he was little, the way he used to hold my hand crossing the street, the nights I stayed up when he had fever, whispering prayers into the dark. And now the same hands that once clung to me had stolen from me. It wasn't the money that broke me, it was the betrayal. My son, my only family left in this world, had looked into my eyes, called me Mom, and still chosen to empty everything I had. Days passed, but the pain did not fade. I sat by the window each evening, watching the road, hoping maybe he would come back and explain. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he was in trouble. But no, one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I saw something that tore away even that fragile hope. A neighbor's boy, excited and talkative, came running to me with a gossip I wished I hadn't heard. "Auntie," he said, his eyes wide, "I saw Daniel at the bus station last night. He was with his wife and her mother. They had big bags, looked like they were going somewhere far. He said something about the coast. The coast. That was where he and his wife had always dreamed of going. A beautiful place with golden sand and blue water. I had once promised I'd help them visit there for their honeymoon, but they couldn't afford it then. And now he had taken my life savings to make it happen. My heart hardened that day. Something inside me shifted, like the soft mother I used to be had died quietly in that kitchen, and something colder was born in her place. The tears stopped coming. The shaking turned to stillness. I sat there, staring at the window, watching the rain start again, and whispered to myself, "He took everything from me. Everything. But he will learn. He will learn what it means to betray a mother's trust." Revenge wasn't a word I had ever thought would touch my life. I was a woman of quiet faith, a believer in kindness. But faith doesn't fill an empty stomach, and kindness doesn't replace stolen years. I decided I wouldn't confront him right away. No, that would be too easy for him. He had chosen to play with deceit, so deceit would be my weapon too. I began to plan, in silence, with the calmness of someone who had already lost everything. I knew Daniel well, his weaknesses, his pride, his need to prove himself. His wife, Clara, was charming but cunning, always whispering things into his ear, always making me feel like I was standing in the way of their happiness. And her mother, a woman of poisonous sweetness, I knew her type too. The kind that smiles in your face while planting thorns behind your back. They had all played a part in this, I was certain. But I wouldn't rush. I would wait, watch, and choose my moment. I sold a few of my belongings quietly, things they wouldn't even know existed, and gathered a small amount of money. Enough to get by, enough to move without drawing attention. I packed a small bag, locked my house, and left before dawn. No one saw me go. The bus ride to the coast was long and filled with silence. I watched the countryside change through the foggy window, villages turning into fields, fields turning into sea breeze and salt air. When I reached the town, I could feel my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a strange calm. I was going to find them, and when I did, I would make them regret ever thinking of me as weak. That night, I stayed in a small inn by the sea. The walls smelled of damp wood, the kind that tells you many tears had been shed there before. I lay awake, listening to the waves crash outside. Each wave sounded like the voice of my late husband whispering through time, "Don't let them break you." I closed my eyes and whispered back, "I won't." The next morning I rose before dawn, the pale light barely cutting through the mist that hung over the small coastal town. I wrapped my shawl tightly around my shoulders and walked toward the marketplace. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and smoke, and somewhere in the distance, gulls cried over the water. I asked around quietly, pretending to be a visiting aunt searching for her family. It didn't take long before someone mentioned a young man and 2 women who had recently rented a house near the docks. They came in a fine carriage, the old fish vendor told me, wiping her hands on her apron. The young man paid in cash. Looked proud, but nervous. The older woman, his wife's mother, I think did all the talking. I thanked her, leaving a few coins behind. My heart pounded. I knew it was them. I walked to the narrow lane behind the harbor and found the house easily. It was a small, pretty place painted white, with flowering vines climbing up the front wall. Through the half-open window, I could hear laughter, his laughter. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring through the lace curtains. There he was, my son, sitting at a table piled high with food I could never have afforded. His wife leaned close to him, feeding him pieces of fruit. Her mother sat opposite, dressed in fine silks, her fingers glittering with new jewelry. The sight burned through me like fire. He looked happy, carefree, as though I had never existed. I wanted to scream, to bang on that door and demand to know how he could betray me. But I didn't. Instead, I turned away. I knew then that my revenge would not be loud or quick. It would be quiet, careful, like the tide that rises inch by inch until it drowns everything in its path. For the next few days, I observed them from a distance. One rented a small room in a boarding house nearby, pretending to be a widow visiting relatives. Every morning, I watched Daniel leave the house. He tried to act important, walking with his head high, pretending to be a man of business. But I noticed the unease in his step. Money runs fast when it isn't earned, and I knew he'd soon learn that lesson. I followed him once to the gambling hall near the docks. The smell of ale and smoke hung heavy in the air. He was there, sitting at a table, throwing dice with men twice his age. He was losing badly. I saw the panic in his eyes as the last coins from my savings slipped through his fingers. My chest ached, but not with pity. This was the beginning of his fall. I left before he could notice me. That night, as the rain began to pour again, I stood near the shore, the wind whipping my hair across my face. The sea looked wild, furious, endless. "Let him drown in his greed," I whispered. But vengeance isn't just about watching someone fail. It's about showing them what they destroyed. So I waited. I watched. Within a few weeks, the laughter from their home grew faint. The new jewelry was pawned. The fine clothes faded. They began to fight loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I became part of the background, just another quiet old woman in the marketplace. People spoke freely around me, not realizing that every word they said fed my plan. One afternoon, I overheard the landlord complaining. "That young man hasn't paid rent for 2 months," he grumbled to a friend. "If he doesn't bring the money soon, I'll throw them out." I smiled under my shawl. The moment was near. That evening, I left a note under their door written in a trembling hand, pretending to be from a local moneylender. It said, "Asterisky, here you are in need of funds. Meet me tomorrow at sunset by the old pier. Bring proof of your honesty." Asterisk, I signed it with a false name. I knew my son well. Desperation would bring him to me. The next evening, I watched from the shadows as he arrived. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and gray, the waves crashing violently against the wooden posts. He looked around nervously, clutching a worn leather bag probably filled with what little valuables they had left. I stepped forward, slowly, letting the light catch just enough of my face for him to see. When his eyes met mine, he froze. "Mother?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch between us until it became unbearable. Then I said softly, "You came." He stammered, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. I can explain. Explain? I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. Explain how you took every coin your father and I saved? How you looked me in the eyes and lied? How you left me to starve while you enjoyed the coast? The wind howled, carrying my words away, but he heard every one. His face turned pale. I didn't mean Clara said she thought. Don't blame her. I cut him off. You made your choice. But tell me, Daniel, has your paradise treated you well? He looked down. His hands shook. We're struggling, he admitted. Things got out of hand. I thought I could win some money back, start a business. With what? I asked bitterly. Stolen dreams? He fell silent. The shame on his face gave me a twisted sense of peace. Mother, please, he finally whispered. I'm sorry. I'll fix it. You can't fix what you broke, I said quietly. But you can feel what it's like to lose everything. He stared at me, confused. What do you mean? I turned away from him, letting the rain hide the tears that finally escaped. You'll know soon enough? And with that, I walked away. Behind me, I heard him call my name, his voice echoing over the waves, but I didn't turn back. The next day, I went to the landlord and offered to pay the rent for their house for 1 more month. But I gave him a condition. He must not tell them who paid. I wanted them to believe in false hope, to think fortune had smiled upon them again. Hope, after all, is the cruelest weapon. For the next few weeks, I watched as they relaxed, as laughter crept back into their home. They thought their luck had turned. But while they were busy celebrating, I was busy undoing every rope that held their little world together. I spoke quietly to the merchants who had given them credit. I reminded them, gently, that Daniel had debts he hadn't paid. I whispered to the landlord that the young man's mother had died, leaving behind unpaid bills. And I visited the gambling hall, where his name was already tarnished, and let slip that he had fled other towns before, always leaving ruin behind. The town that once welcomed him began to turn its back. Doors closed, whispers followed. I could see the panic return to his eyes. One night from my shadowed corner, I watched as he argued with his wife in the street. You promised me everything, she shouted. You said your mother was rich. She was, he cried. But now she's gone. Then we're finished. She screamed and stormed away into the night. He stood there, helpless, soaked in the rain, the same way I had been when I discovered the empty envelope. And I felt no pity, only justice. I watched them unravel the way one watches a fabric being pulled thread by thread, unable to stop and strangely compelled to see how it ends. After the night on the pier, I felt the restlessness in the town grow into something I could steer. People here still lived by their reputations. A whispered lie could travel from one shop to the next like a gust of wind, and a truth, when timed right, could hit harder than any stone. I began to pull my threads carefully. First, I visited the pawn shop where Clara had been pawning the jewelry. The owner remembered her well. He called her a clever woman and told me in confidence that she had been there, with a necklace and a set of rings 2 days after their arrival. Paid in cash, he said, shrugging, but the coin looked stained with worry. I listened and nodded, as if this were small-town gossip, and left a coin on the counter for the chai I pretended to sip. Later that evening I went to the tailor who had made Clara's garments, and to the little pantry where they bought their provisions. Each person had a shard of their life in that town. Each shard fit into the picture I wanted to paint. I spoke gently, as if curious, and let them speak of the couple's grand promises and sudden inability to pay. I watched their eyes change from sympathy to suspicion as details piled up. The landlady, who had been so kind at first, told me she had found a hidden note under the bed, some crude pledge to repay debts signed with Daniel's name. But the ink looked new, she told me, and the handwriting, well, it didn't match his. She frowned, and an idea began to stir in my mind like embers catching. I began leaving small anonymous notes where they would find them, a warning of unpaid debts, a reminder of promises made, a note about how quickly goodwill dries up when coins are gone. I didn't sign my name. I let their own fear become the messenger. Under the pressure, they started to act like people with no safety net. They argued in public, now bits of coral thrown out like scraps for the neighborhood to pick at. Clara accused Daniel of lying about his past. Daniel accused Clara of spending without thinking. The mother-in-law, once quiet and composed, began to show her claws, her calm slipping into bitter counsel and sharper words. One evening, I arranged a small meeting at the market square. I had paid the landlord one last secret month of rent, but I also whispered to him that I had heard word of other debts he could collect if he chose to act. He was a man who preferred certainty to kindness. I watched from the shadows as he knocked on their door and then, with little ceremony, announced that the house was to be vacated. The procession that followed was quiet and ugly, a cart piled with a few boxes, a blanket, a battered cooking pot. Neighbors stopped to stare, and some muttered all the while. I felt something old and powerful turning in me, satisfaction, maybe. Or perhaps a more profound recognition that a lesson had been taught. They stood on the road with their few belongings, faces flushed with indignity, and I felt no pity. The next morning, word spread that the couple had been evicted. The shopkeepers who had given them credit demanded payment in the market with a boldness that left them red-faced and cornered. I made sure that the butcher who once sold them now refused to serve them, that the cobbler would no longer take their promise to pay later. Social life in a small town is a web, and people are spiders who can bite. Each refusal stung. Underneath it all, I planted a rumor that Clara's mother had not always been a mother-in-law, but had traveled between towns with stories that never quite matched the coin she took. I told the story to a woman at the well who had once been cheated by a wandering woman. Her eyes flamed when I mentioned the resemblance. She remembered small details, the way the mother-in-law had once promised returns and then disappeared, the way she had left a trail of lonely houses behind. That woman went to another neighbor and added one memory to another until what had been a whisper became a chorus. They began to lock their doors when Clara walked by. The mother-in-law, who had once smiled and offered tea, now found no chair offered to her. Pride withers fastest when it has no audience. As the town turned its back, Daniel grew frantic. He tried to sell what little they had left, but the market had closed to them. He pounded on doors and begged, a sound that would have broken me if I were still the same woman. Instead, I felt a cold calm. I arranged for an old acquaintance of my late husband, an honest man who kept ledger books like a priest keeps scripture, to come to the market and ask for him by name. Daniel answered, desperate eyes wide, when the man called him out. I had prepared a small piece of proof copies of the bank book pages I had taken when I first discovered the withdrawals. Not the whole book, but enough to show a pattern. In the old man's hand, the pages looked like evidence. The community's curiosity sharpened. Why did you take from your mother? The ledger keeper asked aloud, loud enough for those near the stall to hear. Daniel fell silent. I let the moment grow heavy. In a small town, reputation is a currency stronger than any coin. To be known as a thief is to be poor forever. The ledger keeper did not shout an accusation. He only held the pages and said, there are stories I cannot carry without sharing. That was all it took. A few hands reached for the proofs, and in no time a small circle had formed. People read and gasped. Faces that had once smiled at their door now looked at them as if they were a sickness. The mother-in-law's composure broke first. She tried to speak, to smooth the roughness with her practiced tongue, but her words slid into the crowd like stones skimming across water and sank without ripples. Clara's face crumpled. She pressed her hand to her mouth, and then, in a terrible flash of anger and fear, she turned on Daniel. You liar! She screamed, and in that instant all her charm burned away. You said it would be different. You said you'd make us wealthy. Daniel's shoulders folded. I remember the sound he made then, a small animal sound, something between a sob and a plea. I thought I could fix it, he said. I thought I could make you proud. You thought of yourself, she spat. You thought only of yourself. The town wanted someone to blame, and Daniel fit the shape easily. They called him greedy, a man who had taken from his own blood for the taste of a better life. He tried to protest, to explain that he had meant to return the money, to start a shop, to make a better home, but the words fell flat. The ledger keeper closed his book and turned away, as if tired of holding truth in his hands. I felt something like pity, but pity would have softened my resolve, and I had no intention of softening. Their downfall was not simply for the coin. It was for the betrayal, the tearing of trust that binds a family. As the crowd dispersed, I walked through the market, and hands brushed mine, some in sympathy, most in cold avoidance. I returned to the inn that evening and sat by the window, watching the sea. The waves seemed smaller somehow, as if the tide itself had learned to hush. I thought of the life I had given my son, the meals, the nights of tending his fevered brow, the stitches I sewed in his shirts, and I measured each memory against the theft. Each stitch felt like a ledger entry, each lullaby a promise broken. He had emptied my bank book, yes, but he had also emptied something larger, the idea that the people we love will always take care of us. The town would not forget easily. Even if they left, if they found another place and tried to begin again, the whispers would follow. The mother-in-law would never host tea without someone wondering where the coins had gone. Clara would not walk marketplaces without a few eyes searching for signs of her former indulgence. And Daniel would carry this shame like a stone in his pocket for the rest of his life. That thought should have satisfied me fully, but it did not. I wanted him to feel more than the sense of being shunned. I wanted him to face the consequences of his choices in a way that left no room for future deception. I began to plan the next step, not mere exile, but exposure so thorough that he could not rebuild on the lie. I knew how to push people to the brink where they would reveal their true selves. I would not only show them what he had done, I would force them to see the man he had become when greed swallowed compassion. The next move would be the turning point. I lay awake that night, listening to the creaks of the inn and to my own heartbeat, thinking of how I would deliver the final lesson. I felt no joy in the planning, only a grim determination, the kind that forms like armor on a woman who has been wronged. I did not yet know the exact shape the finale would take, but I knew this. When it came, it would be sharp, clean, and absolute. I knew the town would listen if the story came wrapped in ceremony. People loved occasions. They gathered, they judged, and they forgave only when the story was tidy. So I decided to make an occasion. I visited the church and spoke with the pastor in gentle tones about organizing a small gathering to celebrate the seamstresses and bakers of the town, a harmless fete where neighbors could bring food and crafts and talk of better days. The pastor, who had known me for years, agreed without suspicion. He believed I sought fellowship, and that was all he needed. I sent invitations in a careful, anonymous way. No one would know I had arranged this, only that a celebration had been proposed to lift spirits. I wanted them to come not as accused, but as participants, to sit among their neighbors and let the truth land like a stone in familiar hands. Word spread that an evening of music and small speeches would be held in the square. People prepared cakes and brought cloths to lay on the stalls. The air smelled of yeast and candles. The couple could hardly refuse an invitation. Clara loved a chance to appear respectable, and Daniel wanted nothing more than to be seen, to be thought a man of standing in a place that had already turned its back. I watched them arrive, their faces smoothed with false ease. Clara wore her best dress, the one that once made merchants smile and men stare. She carried a small box of pastries wrapped in wax paper. Daniel kept his jaw tight, trying to look like a man who belonged. His mother-in-law clutched a purse as if it contained all the dignity left to her. The square filled, and the pastor began with innocuous words about community and charity, and people applauded politely. I sat at the edge where the light caught my hair and watched them breathe the same air as their neighbors. Then, at a moment when the crowd's attention was warm and trusting, I rose and walked to the front. The silence that followed felt like the hush before a curtain lifts. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I unfolded a few pages from my coat copies of the bank book slips, the pattern of withdrawals, the dates matching visits, the small entries that proved a hand had reached repeatedly into my savings. I laid them on the table where the refreshments sat and said, simply, "These belong to me." Heads turned. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel's face went the color of old paper. The pastor blinked, taken aback, and then someone murmured, "What is this?" I told the story in a voice that did not tremble. I told them about the envelope, the savings, the sleepless nights, the moments when I had counted coins like prayers. I spoke of the day I found the empty bank book and of the long walk to the coast. I did not shout. I told truth plainly, and truth in a small town is a harder thing than rumor. People listened and the air thickened. When I finished, I placed the copies in the hands of the pastor and the ledger keeper, the honest man who had already shown the town the pattern. "Read them," I said. "Tell them what it means." The ledger keeper, who carried the dignity of age like a cloak, read the entries aloud. He did not need to embellish. The numbers spoke. The crowd's faces shifted shock, then the slow settling of recognition, then anger. Clara began to tremble. She looked toward my hands as if expecting a blow, but none came. I let them feel the weight of their own choices in public light. A woman near me whispered, "How could he?" Another muttered, "His mother," and then stopped, shame taking her words. Daniel tried to speak, to explain, but he was not practiced in words that mattered. His voice caught like a fish on a hook. I thought, he began, and the sentence died. He looked at me then with a bewilderment that almost broke me. "Why are you doing this?" He asked the question of a child who cannot fathom consequence. "Because you took everything," I said. "Because you left me with nothing." The mother-in-law's lips moved as she mouthed a denial, but the crowd had already decided. The town's patience, once generous, had its limit. An older man stepped forward and said, "We trusted him. We helped. Now we have been made fools." The butcher crossed his arms and shook his head. One by one, merchants who had offered credit spoke up about the unpaid coins and broken promises. It was as if every slight had been a thread tied into a noose, and the noose had finally been pulled tight. They demanded recompense, not only for themselves but for the principle of trust violated. The air was rough with hurt. Clara's charm evaporated. Even her mother's practiced composure fell into splinters. People began to count and name what had been lost to them, by association with those who thought themselves above the small laws of decency. I watched Daniel shrink inward, the proud posture of earlier days gone like fog. He tried to bargain with his eyes, to promise restoration, but with what coin could he restore the trust that had been taken? The ledger keeper spoke quietly, and his voice was like the closing of a door. "If a man takes from his own mother," he said, "what else will he take when given chance? We cannot force forgiveness, but we can refuse to be fooled." The crowd's verdict formed like a storm cloud. Some said they would not sell to him again. Others swore never to do business with Clara. A few, more cruel, insisted that they should leave town and never return. The couple stood together for a moment, a small island of denial in a sea of scorn. Then Clara, with a fury that had once turned men's heads, yelled at the crowd, accusing them of cruelty, of turning on strangers. Her words were sharp and hurtful, but they landed on ears hardened by betrayal. She had no understanding of the private cost she had inflicted. She only knew the public survival of appearances. Daniel finally faced his own reflection in the eyes of those who knew him most. He looked at me, and in that gaze there was a fracture. "I'm sorry," he said, so small that it hardly reached the first row. "I took it. I used it. I thought I could fix everything." His confession was not dramatic. It was a thin thread of a man undone. The town did what towns do. People decided to make an example and be done with it. They refused him bread on credit, a favor here, a help there. They would close the doors he had once been welcomed through. There was no court in this decision, no sentence other than the slow provincial machinery of ostracism. I felt the satisfaction that can exist in seeing truth land plainly, but there was also a hollowness. The crowd's justice would teach a lesson, yes, but it wouldn't reach the echo inside me. I had wanted him to feel the full measure of consequence, and the measure was taking shape. His life in that town would be a map of closed doors. After the crowd dispersed, Clara and her mother stood by the cart, hunched and angry. They loaded what little remained and left, not with the dignity they had once displayed, but with the hard, grinding haste of people chased by shame. Daniel lingered, eyes hollow, then turned and walked toward the pier where the sea met sky. I followed at a distance, not to confront him, but to witness the end of something. He stood at the edge of the water, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had been emptied of promise. He did not ask for my forgiveness. He did not implore. He only said, "I will leave." I could have watched him go and felt the rage ease. But the part of me that had once sewn his shirts and soothed his fevers wanted one last thing, to be seen for the magnitude of the wrong done. So I walked to him and stood close enough that the wind could not carry my words away. "Go," I said. "Leave and build your life where no one knows your name." He looked as if he might collapse on the sand. "Will you ever forgive me?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. I thought of every night I had sat in the dark counting coins, thinking of his future, of every stitch and every prayer. I let the silence stretch until it pressed on him. "Not now," I said. "Perhaps never. But you will remember how it felt to be empty." He turned then and walked away, shoulders bowed, the sea swallowing his outline. I watched until he was gone, and when the last shape vanished into distance and a carriage left the docks, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my bones. The revenge I had planned had not been about breaking him with violence or with ruin beyond repair. It had been about returning what he had taken in the currency that mattered most: reputation, belonging, a place to stand in the world. He would carry this weight like a scar. As the sun dipped, I walked back to the inn, hands in my pockets, the evening air prickling against my face. I had exposed the theft and watched the town's judgment fall. The next steps were quieter practical matters to ensure I would not be left destitute again. And yet, even as I thought of ledgers and coins, a part of me recognized that I had crossed a line. Revenge had reshaped me. It had given me a power I did not particularly enjoy, a certain hardness that would not easily soften. I slept that night with the sound of the sea in my ears, and for the first time in weeks. The old clock back home would have ticked on without me. Marking time in a house I no longer knew how to live in, the days after Daniel left felt oddly hollow, as if a door had closed behind me and the room inside had been rearranged without my consent. People would nod politely when we passed in the market, their eyes skimming past me like a hand skimming a stone, testing the surface but not wanting to learn what lay beneath. Their kindness was a thin film, and beneath it I felt the memory of all I had lost. I returned to my small room at the inn and sat by the shuttered window, thinking of the life that had once been mine. I had taken steps to secure what little remained mending the few clothes I had left, selling a vase or two, keeping a careful ledger in a neat hand, But money was not the only thing that needed mending. Trust, once broken, is a fragile thing to rebuild, and I had shown Daniel that some breaks cannot be repaired without great cost. Yet even as I tried to fold myself back into a quieter existence, a new thought began to haunt me. The mother-in-law and Clara had not simply been accessories to Daniel's betrayal. They had pushed, seduced, and promised him a life he could not sustain. They had encouraged him to take risks, to borrow against the future as if the future belonged to them. They had shaped his decisions. I realized then that exposing him in the town was only part of the reckoning. If I wanted true justice, I had to ensure the hand that taught him those false promises would feel the consequences too. The idea formed slowly, like a seed pushing through soil. I could not return to a life of petty measures. No. The next act would be to unmask the mother-in-law and Clara in a way that left no comfortable corner for them to hide. I began to gather more information quietly. I learned that the mother-in-law had a name the town did not know well, a name she used when she moved from place to place. She had relatives in a city some distance away, and rumors floated that she had once been involved in schemes that left people poorer and angrier. Clara, too, had a history. Behind her bright smiles were debts and promises with many names attached. I visited the courthouse-like office where official papers were filed and asked, as any curious visitor might, about names and addresses tied to Clara and her mother. Officials remembered little, or at least they said they did not, but I saw a ledger of complaints tucked in a drawer where the clerk sipped his tea. It was the sort of careless place people hide truth in plain sight. That night, I returned to my room with a small stack of notes and names. I set them on the table and let the lamplight play across each scrap. Each name was a thread, and if I tugged at the right ones, I could unravel more than a single household. I could force the mother-in-law's past to meet her present. I took the next few days to travel, not far, but far enough that letters could be sent and calls could be made without attracting attention. I wrote to a few people whose names I had found, telling them in plain language what I suspected and what I had seen. I wrote as a concerned neighbor, as a woman who had seen a pattern, someone impartial and worried for the common good. People are quick to respond to the scent of scandal. They want to be right, to have known of something first. My letters were small embers, and they did what embers do catch. Replies came back in the form of short, clipped notes and one or two old court filings. A name I had only half believed began to appear repeatedly. A small town some miles inland where the mother-in-law had once been involved in a failed textile venture. That venture had left unpaid bills and a few angry men knocking on doors. I read the papers and felt a satisfaction that was cooler than the heat of anger. The evidence assembled itself like a map. With each new piece, the picture grew clearer. I was patient. Patience had been my teacher through widowhood and poverty. I did not rush. I wrote again, this time to a woman who insisted she had been wronged by the mother-in-law years ago. Her letter arrived on coarse paper, her handwriting shaky but fierce. She described how money had vanished, how promises had been made and then never kept, how the mother-in-law had moved on without apology. The woman's anger fed me. It made my purpose feel less like personal vengeance and more like an act of setting a record straight. I then turned my attention to the small world where Clara and her mother now tried to rebuild. They had fled the coast with little more than a cart, but people whispered they intended to travel inland, to find a new place where reputations were not so closely held. I decided to give them a farewell they would not forget. While writing letters and arranging quiet inquiries, I also started to plan a way to bring them back into the public eye in a manner that would reveal what I had uncovered. I could not simply follow them and cry out their past. I had to lay it before them in the exact light they had used to deceive. So I sent one more anonymous note, this time to a traveling merchant known for his honesty and for keeping good company. I told him that Clara and her mother would be passing through a nearby market on a certain day, and that there were people in the merchant's town who would wish to speak with them. The merchant, intrigued by matters of commerce and reputation, agreed to watch for them. The morning the caravan arrived, I took a seat in the market where the merchant sold his wares. The air was thick with dust and the smell of roasting meat. People bartered and laughed, but I sat very still, my fingers wrapped around a cup of black tea, waiting. When they arrived, Clara's carriage was modest, but she carried herself as if it were gilded. Her mother's head was held high. They stepped down and scanned the crowd as if searching for friends. I watched them stroll among the stalls, seeking the warmth of new faces, and I felt the memory of the coins in my hand like a cold stone. At the merchant's stall, I heard the first murmured question. A woman stepped forward and asked, not rudely, but with the authority of someone who had been burned before, "Excuse me, are you by any chance the woman who promised work in textiles and left families without pay?" Clara's smile faltered. Her mother's lips tightened. People began to gather, like birds drawn to the sudden snap of a twig. A man who sold thread came forward and held up a shabby note, an unpaid IOU bearing the mother-in-law's signature. The air changed. People's eyes sharpened in the way they do when they realize a pattern is not just a single act but a repeat. Clara tried to laugh it off and claim ignorance, but the merchant had received my letters and had also taken the trouble to bring a man who had been part of that textile venture. He spoke with a slow, steady anger that left little room for the practiced curves of Clara's speech. He told how the business had failed and how the mother-in-law had vanished with coin and promise. People on the square listened, and with each detail the past and present braided into a tighter rope around them. Clara's face flushed with a color that spoke of both shame and pride that had sustained her until the truth found a louder voice. Someone shouted for the constable. Someone else demanded that they leave the market immediately. There was no formal trial, only the swift, rough justice of a community that had been forced to notice. They packed up their small goods with hands that trembled and eyes that darted. I watched them go, feeling an odd dissonance. The satisfaction I had expected to be loud was quiet, seeping into my bones rather than rushing through them. I had peeled away the mask that allowed them to walk into new towns and new lives as if no wrong had been done. The world had been kinder to them because names were flexible, but a name that carries shame has weight, and soon people carry the weight of reputations as if it were their own luggage. When they left the market, they did not look back. Perhaps they were used to being followed by whispers, but this time the whispers were facts, and facts do not tire. That evening I returned to my room and opened the small ledger I kept. My handwriting was neat, each entry deliberate. I recorded what I had done not as a triumph, but as a ledger of a life rearranged. Rent paid for a month, letters posted, inquiries made, the cost of a night's stay at the inn. I was pragmatic. Revenge had costs. I traced the edges of the ledger with a fingernail and felt the faint satisfaction of an account balanced. Yet even as I balanced the books, something else stirred in me, not triumph, but a hollowed reflection on what I had become. The woman who had stitched her son's shirts now plotted exposure and humiliation. The tender mother had been forged into an agent of ruin, and the transformation left me with a strange, heavy regret. I did not regret the exposure. I believed it was just. But I regretted how deeply I had let myself go into the mechanics of revenge. There was a softness I had lost, a softness that had once held me through nights of sickness and small triumphs. That night I slept fitfully, waking to the sound of the sea and the memory of a small hand that had once held mine, the child who had been my whole world. The next morning I packed my bag and left the inn. I had done what I set out to do in that town. The couple had been unmasked and forced to move on. My path would soon lead me home, but I knew that the home I had left would no longer feel the same. I had changed its contour with my own hands. As I walked toward the carriage that would take me away, I looked back once at the town and felt a cool wind pass over me, as if the world were exhaling. I tucked the ledger into my bag and thought of the final acts yet to be played. The road ahead was long, and there were more names to settle, more accounts to balance. My hands had learned the rhythm of careful planning, and though I hoped the next pages would be quieter, I knew the story had reached a point of no return. The road home was long, and with each turn of the wheels, I felt the past and the present tug at each other like two threads fighting to hold the same needle. The countryside stretched in waves of green and gold, fields bending under the wind, and I watched them from the carriage window as if the land itself were reminding me of the time before betrayal, when my heart was lighter and my love for Daniel was simple. Every bump on the road seemed to shake loose another memory, his laughter when he was small, his stubborn pride as a young man, his wedding day when I had tried to hide the ache in my chest beneath a forced smile. I wondered if he remembered those moments, or if they had been replaced by the hollow echoes of what he had done. The closer I got to home, the heavier my body felt. When I arrived, the house stood waiting like an old, loyal friend who had endured long neglect, dust on the windowsills, the faint smell of disuse, but still there, still mine. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence was thick, almost breathing. I set down my bag and let my hand rest on the old wooden table, tracing the grooves Daniel's father had carved when he built it for me. There was comfort in the familiarity of small imperfections. I walked through each room slowly, remembering where everything used to be, touching the edges of furniture, letting the ghosts of routine return one by one. It felt both like homecoming and trespass. I lit a lamp, and the faint light trembled against the walls. In that moment, I realized revenge had given me justice, yes, but it had also taken something I could not name. There was no peace in victory, only a quieter kind of loneliness. I sat by the window that faced the garden, the same one where Daniel used to chase fireflies as a boy. The garden was overgrown now, weeds strangling the flowers, yet in that wildness there was something honest. Life had gone on without me. I brewed a small pot of tea and sat in silence until dawn began to color the sky. I thought of Daniel again, not as the man who had emptied my account, but as the child who used to run barefoot through the yard, bringing me stones and broken toys, asking for stories. That image hurt more than any of his betrayals. I wondered where he was, whether he had eaten, whether he carried even a shred of remorse. Days passed. I repaired the house bit by bit, cleaning, fixing, bringing it back to life. Routine became my balm. I began sewing again, taking in mending work for the villagers who lived nearby. Some of them had heard whispers of what happened. People always do, but they spoke gently around me, offering respect and quiet admiration. "You did what you had to," one woman said as she handed me a torn dress to repair. I smiled faintly, but I didn't answer. Deep down, I wasn't sure if I had done what I had to, or what I wanted to. One afternoon, as I sat stitching by the window, I saw a familiar shape on the horizon, a lone figure walking slowly up the road. My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as the figure drew closer, I saw the way he carried himself, the stoop of his shoulders, the way his steps seemed uncertain, as if weighed down by the past. Daniel. He was thinner than before, his clothes worn, his eyes hollow but searching. My first instinct was to close the door and pretend not to be home, but my hands wouldn't move. He reached the gate and stopped. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind moved between us, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Finally, he said softly, "I didn't know where else to go." His voice cracked on the last word, and something in me wavered. "You shouldn't have come," I said, my tone steady but not cruel. He nodded as if he already knew that would be my answer. "I just wanted to see you once more," he whispered. "To say, I know now what I've done. I lost everything. Clara's gone. Her mother left her, and she blamed me for everything. I tried to fix it, I really did. But I couldn't. I thought money would make life easier. I thought taking from you would be temporary. I told myself I'd pay it back." He looked down at his hands. But I never did. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. The mother in me, the part that no betrayal could ever fully kill, wanted to reach out, to touch his face, to forgive him. But the wound was still raw, the trust still in ashes. "You took not just my money, Daniel," I said quietly. "You took my peace, my sleep, my belief that I had raised a good man." His eyes filled with tears. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I studied him, the lines around his eyes, the defeat in his shoulders. He looked older than his years, as if guilt had carved its own wrinkles into his skin. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "Only to know that you're all right." I looked at him for a long time, the way a person might look at the sea, vast, familiar, and unknowable. Then, slowly, I stepped aside from the doorway. "Come in," I said. He blinked, startled, but obeyed. Inside, he sat on the edge of the chair like a boy waiting to be scolded. The silence between us was thick with all the words we'd never said. I poured him tea, my hands shaking slightly, and for a moment it was as if time folded back on itself. The sight of him holding the cup brought back years of breakfasts, laughter, ordinary mornings that now felt like scenes from another life. "You look tired," I said. "I haven't slept much," he murmured. "It's hard to when you know what you've done." We sat in silence again. Then I said, "You can stay the night in the shed. There's hay and a blanket. But tomorrow you'll go. I can't live with the past walking my halls." He nodded slowly. "Thank you." That night, as I lay in bed, I could hear the faint sound of him moving in the shed, the creak of wood, the rustle of straw. I thought about forgiveness, about whether it was truly possible or just a word we say to feel better. I wanted to forgive him, but forgiveness felt like a door I couldn't yet unlock. Perhaps one day, when the echoes of what he'd done faded enough, I might find the key. But not yet. Morning came with pale light and a chill in the air. I made bread and left a small loaf on the table by the door, along with a few coins and an old coat that once belonged to his father. When I went to the shed, it was empty. He had gone quietly, leaving behind a small folded note. I opened it with trembling hands. Asterisk, thank you for letting me see you. I'll spend my life trying to be the man you raised. Daniel. I stood there for a long time, the paper soft between my fingers, and tears I hadn't known I was holding began to fall. I let them come, not as a sign of weakness, but as the final release of all that had been held in for too long. As the days turned to weeks, I found myself thinking less of revenge and more of rebuilding, not just my home, but my heart. I tended the garden, planted new seeds, and let the rhythm of the earth remind me that even after devastation, life finds a way to bloom again. Sometimes at dusk, I'd sit by the window and imagine Daniel somewhere far away, working, changing, maybe even forgiving himself. I would never know for sure, but in that uncertainty, there was a fragile kind of peace. Revenge had been my weapon, but forgiveness, even partial, hesitant forgiveness, became my healing. And though the scars of betrayal would never fully fade, I learned something the hard way. Justice may restore what was taken, but only compassion can restore what was lost within. The seasons began to move again, slow and deliberate, as if the world had been waiting for me to finally let go of its stillness. The fields around my house turned green, then gold, then pale with frost. Months passed quietly, without news of Daniel, without letters, without whispers. In that silence, I began to find rhythm again, small, ordinary acts that rebuilt the shape of a life. I mended clothes for neighbors, taught a few village girls how to sew straight seams, and sometimes baked bread to share on Sundays. People had stopped asking questions. They treated me with the respect they reserved for someone who had survived something unspeakable and come out the other side. I was not proud exactly, but I was steady. The pain had dulled to something livable, like an old injury that aches only when it rains. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the last light fade, I heard the sound of wheels on the gravel road. My heart jumped, though I didn't know why. A small cart came into view, and on it sat a man I didn't recognize. He was older, his face weathered by travel, and beside him, wrapped in a thin blanket, sat a little boy, perhaps 5 or 6. The cart stopped by my gate, and the man climbed down. "Pardon, ma'am," he said with a polite nod. "Are you Mrs. Carter?" "Yes," I replied slowly. "Who's asking?" He tipped his hat. "Name's Graham. I came from the East Road. I was told to bring this boy here. Said he's your grandson." The words landed like stones. "My grandson?" I echoed, disbelief knotting my throat. The man nodded. "His father's name is Daniel. He said if anything happened to him, I was to bring the boy to you. I found him sick last month in a town called Brookfield. Didn't make it through the fever. But before he passed, he gave me a letter." He reached into his coat and handed me a folded piece of paper, edges worn, sealed with the faint remains of wax. My hands trembled as I took it. The boy looked up at me with wide brown eyes, Daniel's eyes, but softer, innocent. He had his father's shape, but there was no guilt in his face, only the confusion of a child who had traveled too far. "What's your name, sweetheart?" I asked gently. "Eli," he said. "Papa said you'd be nice." My breath caught. I knelt and touched his cheek, the warmth of his skin grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I'm your grandmother," I said softly. "You're safe now." The man Graham nodded, tipping his hat again. "He's quiet but good," he said. "Didn't have much. I'll leave you be." I tried to offer him coins for his trouble, but he waved them off. "He's where he belongs," he said simply, then drove away into the dusk, leaving me standing by the gate with the boy's small hand clutching mine and Daniel's final letter trembling in my other hand. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I brought Eli inside, made him soup, and wrapped him in a blanket by the fire. He watched the flames with sleepy eyes, and when I tucked him into the spare bed, he whispered, "I miss Papa." I brushed his hair back and said, "He loved you very much?" The lie and the truth coexisted. Daniel had loved him. Of that I was certain, even if love had come too late to save him. When the house was quiet, I sat by the fire and opened the letter. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably Daniel's. Asterisk mother, asterisk asterisk. If this letter reaches you, it means I am gone. I tried, truly I did. After I left your house, I found work with a carpenter in Brookfield. I stayed sober, I kept my word, I sent what little I could to Clara before she left for good. I wanted to write you sooner, but I was ashamed. I had nothing worth your forgiveness yet. Then Eli was born, and for the first time, I understood what you had given me all those years, love without measure. When he looked at me, I saw every wrong I had done and every chance I still had to make something right. I told him about you, about how strong you were, how you kept a home when the world turned its back. I told him that if I couldn't raise him myself, he should find you because no one would love him more. I don't know if I'll ever earn peace for what I did, but I hope you'll let him grow up knowing the best of who I was, not the worst. Take care of him, and if you can, forgive me. I love you. Daniel. Asterisk. By the time I finished reading, the ink was blurred by my tears. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. There was no anger left in me, only sorrow and something gentler than forgiveness but close enough to touch it. I whispered into the quiet, "I forgive you, my son." It wasn't a declaration, not something loud or final, but a small truth that settled in the air like a sigh. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling across the floor and the sound of Eli laughing softly in his sleep. I watched him for a moment and felt a warmth spread through me. He was a second chance, not for Daniel, but for me. Through him, I could rebuild what had been broken, not by revenge or justice, but by love. Days turned into weeks, and life found its rhythm again. Eli brought laughter back into the house. He asked endless questions about the world, about his father, about the stars. I told him stories, some true, some softened, about Daniel's childhood, about how he loved to climb trees and how he used to bring me pebbles and pretend they were jewels. I didn't tell him about the betrayal, not yet. Children deserve the luxury of innocence, at least for a while. I worked harder than I had in years, teaching him, feeding him, holding his small hand as we walked to the market. People smiled when they saw us together. Some whispered, but most only nodded kindly, as if life had balanced itself again. One evening, after putting Eli to bed, I took Daniel's letter and placed it in a small wooden box, along with the few bank slips that had once represented everything he stole. I tied them together with a piece of thread, one red, one white, and whispered a quiet prayer. Let this be the last time our lives are counted in coins. I buried the box beneath the old oak in the garden, the same tree Daniel once climbed as a boy. It felt right that the soil which had once held his laughter would now hold the story of our pain and forgiveness. As the earth covered the box, I felt something lift from me, not joy, not even relief, but release. I had spent so many years defining myself by loss and betrayal that I had forgotten how to live beyond them. Now, with Eli's laughter in the house and Daniel's ghost finally at rest, I began to remember. Grace went outside and stood beneath the great oak. The children sat in a half-circle around her, waiting. The lanterns swayed in the evening air, their light painting gold across the faces of those who had never known the pain that began the story, only the love that survived it. She took a deep breath and began, "Once there was a woman who gave everything she had for her son." Her voice was clear, steady, and filled with warmth. As she spoke, the wind picked up softly, rustling through the branches above her. Some said it was just the evening breeze. But Grace paused, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Hello, Grandma," because she knew I was there. I always was. Inside the house, Eli rested in his chair, eyes closed, a faint smile touching his lips. The setting sun poured gold across the floor, and for a moment, it looked like he was bathed in light. He whispered one last time, barely audible, "We did it, Grandma. We broke the curse." And then, peacefully, he was gone. His last breath was not a sound of sorrow, it was a sigh of completion. The cycle had ended. The next morning, the school bells rang not with mourning but with gratitude. Grace hung his picture beside mine on the wall of the classroom, a simple frame of wood with the words, "Love endures beyond loss." The children placed wildflowers beneath it. No tears, only quiet smiles. Life, after all, had not been taken from us. It had been passed down. As decades stretched on, the Carter School became a beacon for children from all walks of life. Scholars, dreamers, orphans, wanderers all found refuge there. They came seeking knowledge and left with something far more powerful, compassion. And though my story became a legend, softened by time and retelling, its heart remained true. Mothers would whisper it to their daughters, fathers to their sons, reminding them that betrayal can break bones but not the soul. If the soul chooses to forgive, centuries later, long after even Grace's grandchildren had grown old, the oak still stood. People began calling it the Tree of Mercy. They said anyone who sat beneath it and wept for their pain would leave lighter than before. Lovers carved their initials into its bark. Children played around its roots, and travelers stopped to rest, not knowing that beneath their feet lay the resting place of a letter, a locket, and a lifetime of redemption, and somewhere beyond the reach of time. I watched it all. The laughter, the lessons, the endless blooming of life. The revenge that once consumed me had turned into something far greater, a legacy of healing. I was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. I was the woman who turned betrayal into beauty. If you, listening to this story, have ever been broken by those you loved, remember this. What they take from you can be rebuilt in another form. They may empty your hands, but they cannot empty your heart unless you let them. Forgive not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. And when life feels too heavy, go find your own oak tree, whatever it may be. Sit beneath it, breathe. Let the past sink into the soil and plant something new in its place. Because someday, long after you're gone, that seed may become someone else's shelter. That was the end of my story and the beginning of many others. The house still stands. The garden still blooms. The oak still listens. And if you walk by on a quiet evening, when the wind is soft and the sky begins to blush with sunset, you might just hear a faint voice carried through the leaves, whispering the words that saved me. Strength is just love that never gave up. Years turned into centuries. And though my body had long since become part of the earth, my story, our story, refused to die. The Carter House became more than just a school. It became a sanctuary for those who had known betrayal and sought to turn it into something gentler. Teachers came and went, generations passed, and every one of them added a verse to the story I once began in pain. They called it the Legacy of Forgiveness, and each year, on the anniversary of Ellen's passing, a candle was lit in every room of the school, not for mourning, but for remembrance. Because remembrance, I learned, is not about holding on to pain. It's about honoring what pain taught you. The oak tree, once small and fragile when Daniel was a boy, now towered over everything. Its roots reached deep into the earth where my buried box still rested. Sometimes when the night was still and the moonlight soft, people swore they could see faint glimmers beneath the soil like the earth itself remembered the gold of a mother's forgiveness. Birds nested in its branches, children climbed its limbs, and lovers whispered promises beneath its shade. And though none of them had met me, they spoke of me as if I were still there. The mother of the oak, they called me. The one who turned loss into legacy. One stormy evening, long after the school had become a part of history, a young woman named Clara, named unknowingly after my son's wife, arrived at the village. She was lost, heartbroken, betrayed by someone she trusted. She had nothing left but the clothes she wore and the ache of disappointment. She sought shelter under the oak tree, shivering as the rain poured down. And as lightning lit the sky, she saw it words carved deep into the bark. Worn with age but still legible. Asterisk, strength is just love that never gave up. Asterisk. She traced the letters with trembling fingers and wept. By morning, the rain had passed, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Calm. She walked to the old school building, now turned into a home for wanderers, and asked if she could stay. The caretaker, an old man with kind eyes, nodded. "You're welcome here," he said. "Everyone who finds their way to this place comes seeking peace." And so she stayed. Days became weeks, weeks turned into months. She began helping with the children, teaching them to read, telling them stories under the oak. One evening, while sweeping the porch, she found something small glinting between the floorboards, a faded coin tarnished by time. On one side, the markings had worn away. On the other, faint but visible, were the words for luck. She smiled through tears and whispered, "Thank you." The world kept moving. Yet the energy of what began in betrayal continued to ripple outward, changing people, healing strangers, mending hearts. My story, once rooted in pain, had become something much larger than me. It had become proof that even broken things can bloom. And in that eternal space where souls linger, I watched all of it unfold. The children, the laughter, the forgiveness passed from hand to hand like a sacred heirloom. I had once believed revenge was the only justice worth seeking. Now I knew better. True justice wasn't in destruction, it was in creation. In rebuilding what others had tried to ruin. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, the oak stood silhouetted against the gold light. The wind whispered through its leaves, carrying the voices of all who had lived and loved beneath it. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear them merge into one voice, a chorus of generations saying, "We forgive, we endure, we love." The story that began with loss ended with legacy. Daniel's sin became Eli's purpose. My heartbreak became Grace's wisdom. And through every life that touched the Carter soil, forgiveness kept finding new shapes. If you've listened this far, then maybe this story wasn't just mine, it was meant for you too. Maybe you've carried your own betrayal, your own ache, the kind that burns in the chest and won't let go. Maybe you've dreamed of revenge the way I once did. But hear me now, there's a light beyond that darkness. There's a peace that waits on the other side of letting go. Revenge gives you fire for a moment. Forgiveness gives you warmth for a lifetime. And when your heart feels too heavy, when the world feels too cruel, find your oak tree. Sit beneath it. Let the wind carry your pain away, leaf by leaf, until all that's left is the stillness where love can return. Then stand, walk forward, and live. Because no matter what they took from you, they can never take away your power to begin again. The sun set on the Carter home that evening, its final rays catching the wooden sign at the school gate. Time had faded the letters, but the message still glowed, carved deep and eternal.